Welcome to Church of God Jesus Witnesses. Today I would like to share the study titled Chapter 9. Which one is biblical? Sunrise theory or sunset theory? The beginning of a day is sunrise in the creation of 6 days. Let's confirm this through the Bible by first turning to Genesis, chapter 1 verses 1 and 2.
In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters.
Since darkness was over the surface of the deep, there was only darkness. There was no evening nor morning. There was no day and no night. It was still before eternity. Genesis 1 verses 1 to 2 shows the eternal condition before the creation of 6 days.
In Genesis chapter 1 verses 3 and 4, "And God said, Let there be light, and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning the first day."
The moment God said, "Let there be light," was the beginning of the first day of creation. God separated the light from the darkness, and God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. When the day and night were created for the first time, morning and evening formed the boundary between day and night. After finishing the creation of the first day, it became sunset. After spending the night, one day was completed, and it became sunrise again. The Bible said it was the first day.
In Genesis chapter 1 verse 5 it says, "And there was evening, and there was morning the first day."
In Genesis chapter 1 verse 5, "There was evening" means the completion of daytime, and "there was morning" means the completion of nighttime. Since the light was created in the darkness, the day began, and one day of 24 hours was completed with day and night. Let's take a look at the Jewish division of the day into hours. You can find a parable on the owner of the vineyard and the laborers in Matthew 20 verses 1 to 12. If you look closely at the parable, the custom of Jews is to divide the daylight portion of the day into 12 hours.
For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire men to work in his vineyard. He agreed to pay them a denarius for the day and sent them into his vineyard. About the third hour he went out and saw others standing in the marketplace doing nothing. He told them, "You also go and work in my vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right." So they went. He went out again about the 6th hour and the 9th hour and did the same thing. When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, "Call the workers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last ones hired and going on to the first." The workers who were hired about the 11th hour came, and each received a denarius. So when those came who were hired first, they expected to receive more. But each one of them also received a denarius. When they received it, they began to grumble against the landowner. "These men who were hired last worked only 1 hour," they said, "and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the work and the heat of the day."
As seen in Matthew 20 verses 1 to 12, the owner went out early in the morning to hire laborers to work in his vineyard, and he also went out about the 3rd hour, about the 6th and 9th hour, and about the 11th hour to hire more workers. And when evening came, he paid a denarius to the laborer who was hired at the 11th hour, even though they were hired last and only worked 1 hour. Through the context of the parable in Matthew 20 verses 1 to 12, you can see the custom of the Jews was to divide the daylight portion of the day into 12 hours from sunrise to sunset. Sunrise is 0 o'clock, the beginning of a day. Let's take a look at the meaning of a day, which appears in the Linguistic Habits by turning to Ruth chapter 1 verse 12 to 13.
"Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters. It is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has gone out against me."
In Ruth chapter 1 verses 12 to 13, while they are having some dialogue, she calls the coming night not tomorrow night, but tonight. This is because the reference point of a day is sunrise and not sunset.
And in Joshua chapter 4 verses 1 through 3, it says that when the whole nation had finished crossing the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, "Choose 12 men from among the people, one from each tribe, and tell them to take up 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan, from right where the priests stood, and to carry them over with you, and put them down at the place where you stay tonight."
The word tonight in Joshua chapter 4 verses 1 to 3 was used to mean future time. This is also because the reference point of the day is sunrise and not sunset. We can find so many cases which support that the reference point of the day is sunrise, from the linguistic habits of Jews. We can also see the time system through the process of Jesus' funeral. On the day of Jesus' death, the disciples proceeded with Jesus' funeral quickly to complete all procedures before the Sabbath. The Bible said that it was very near to the Sabbath when the funeral process was completed. It meant that the time of the end of the funeral was just before the beginning of the Sabbath. Then what time was it when the disciples finished the funeral? Was it the time of sunrise or the time of sunset? If it was the time of sunrise, it means that the beginning of the day of Sabbath was the time of sunrise. Let's take a look at a few more verses in the Bible.
In John chapter 19 verse 14, Jesus was sentenced to crucifixion at dawn. In Mark 15 verses 24 to 25, hung on the cross at 9 a.m. And in Matthew chapter 27 verses 45 through 46, and Luke 23 verses 44 to 46, and died around 3 p.m.
It is impossible to believe that the funeral had been completed before sunset. It would have taken a long time for the disciples to be given Jesus' body. It would have also taken long for all funeral procedures to be done according to the Jewish burial custom, and just as long to place the body of Jesus in the new tomb. Let's see how many processes and procedures had to be completed before Jesus' body was laid on a stone grave. We can also confirm that it wasn't sunset, but just before sunrise, when all the funeral procedures were completed, by turning to Matthew 27 verses 57 to 62.
As evening approached, there came a rich man from Arimathea, named Joseph, who had himself become a disciple of Jesus. Going to Pilate, he asked for Jesus' body, and Pilate ordered that it be given to him. Joseph took the body, wrapped it in a clean linen cloth, and placed it in his own new tomb that he had cut out of the rock. He rolled a big stone in front of the entrance to the tomb and went away. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were sitting there opposite the tomb. The next day, the one after Preparation Day, the chief priests and the Pharisees went to Pilate.
As recorded in the book of Matthew, after the death of Jesus, a man from Arimathea named Joseph came to a place called Golgotha requesting Jesus' body. He went to Pilate for permission to take the body of Jesus. Pilate then ordered that Jesus' body be given to Joseph of Arimathea. Joseph of Arimathea requested the body of Jesus so that he and Nicodemus could prepare it for Jesus' funeral according to Jewish custom before being placed in a new tomb. However, Matthew did not keep a detailed record of Jesus' funeral procedures. He also did not document all the steps that were involved before Joseph of Arimathea was given the body of Jesus. As a result, readers may misunderstand that all funerals had ended in several hours. If you look closely at the contents of other Gospels, you can see that the process of taking Jesus' body was both difficult and time-consuming. Let's take a look at how the process of preparing for the funeral of Jesus took a long time. Before the disciples were even permitted to take over the body of Jesus, certain procedures and processes needed to be followed. They had to go to the governor's residence, request an interview, explain the reason for wanting the body of Jesus, and obtain a permit in writing, all of which was not easy to do. It was also a long commute to travel from Golgotha to Pilate's office. It also took some time before receiving the permit for Jesus' body to be released to the disciples, as opposed to receiving a verbal agreement. Let's take a look at a few more verses in the Bible by turning to Mark chapter 15 verses 42 to 45.
It was Preparation Day, that is, the day before the Sabbath. So as evening approached, Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent member of the council, who was himself waiting for the kingdom of God, went boldly to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. Pilate was surprised to hear that he was already dead. Summoning the centurion, he asked him if Jesus had already died. When he learned from the centurion that it was so, he gave the body to Joseph.
To summarize what we just read, Jesus died at about 3 p.m. According to Mark's record, the time when Joseph of Arimathea came was when evening was already approaching. Because the death of Jesus was through crucifixion and he was executed by public authorities, it was required to obtain a permit from Pilate to take over Jesus' body. After confirming that Jesus died, Joseph of Arimathea left Golgotha to reach Pilate at his office, which took some time for Joseph to get to. It was also not easy for Joseph of Arimathea to meet with Roman Governor Pilate on his own. Fortunately, he was able to meet the governor because of his position as a member of the council. Upon receiving the request from Joseph of Arimathea, Pilate also needed to confirm whether or not Jesus had died on the cross. After hearing that Jesus had died, Pilate sent a messenger to call the centurion who went to Golgotha, and only after confirming his official report that Jesus had died gave orders to give the permit for Joseph of Arimathea to take over Jesus' body. Through the comprehensive comparison, study, and analysis of the four Gospels, it is reasonable to see that the time it took to release Jesus' body to the disciples was already after sunset. After hearing that Jesus had died, Pilate sent a messenger to call the centurion who went to Golgotha, and only after confirming his official report that Jesus had died gave orders to give the permit for Joseph of Arimathea to take over Jesus' body. Through the comprehensive comparison, study, and analysis of the four Gospels, it is reasonable to see that the time it took to release Jesus' body to the disciples was already after sunset. It was also necessary to travel back and forth from the execution site to Pilate's official residence twice before getting Pilate's permission. We can see that handing over the body of someone after being executed by public authorities is not so easily done. We can also see that it would have taken some time for Pilate to have received Joseph's request. Furthermore, to order that a subordinate check the execution result for Jesus, and then respond to Joseph's request after learning about Jesus' death. Could Pilate's words have helped the Roman soldier hand over Jesus' body to the disciples? Maybe further documentation was needed from Pilate? With all the processes and procedures put in place, we can see that it had to take a long time for the disciples to receive Jesus' body. It was written in the Bible that the arrest, the trial, the execution, and the funeral of Jesus took place in a day, that is, the preparation day or the day before the Sabbath. If the sunset should be the ending time of the preparation day and the beginning time of the Sabbath, it is impossible for all of these events to have happened before the sunset. Furthermore, the funeral process performed by the disciples was not as simple as it seemed because it involved more than just putting Jesus' body on a stone grave. The disciples would have needed to take over the body of Jesus and carefully move his body to another location so that it would be prepared for his funeral. The body of Jesus would then need to be washed thoroughly. They would have needed to wrap it with spices and strips of linen, to be done all in accordance with the Jewish burial custom. It also took time to commute and transport the body of Jesus carefully to the new tomb cut out of rock. Time was also needed to place the body inside the tomb and to roll a stone against the entrance to the tomb. To confirm what was just said through the Bible, let's turn to John chapter 19 verses 38 to 40.
Later, Joseph of Arimathea asked Pilate for the body of Jesus. Now Joseph was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly because he feared the Jews. With Pilate's permission, he came and took the body away. He was accompanied by Nicodemus, the man who earlier had visited Jesus at night. Nicodemus brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds. Taking Jesus' body, the two of them wrapped it, with the spices, in strips of linen. This was in accordance with Jewish burial customs.
As seen in the book of John, all procedures of the funeral were based on the Jewish burial custom. It would have taken a lot of time to use spices, about 75 pounds according to the Jewish funeral law. After Jesus' body had been cleaned, it could not have been finished within a couple of hours. Aside from having to cleanse Jesus' body, the disciples had to use a mixture of myrrh and aloes, which was about 75 pounds. They also had to wrap his body with a mixture of spices, in strips of linen. Every step of the funeral would have been done solemnly and reverently in sorrow. Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus were from a prestigious family, so they knew the Jewish burial customs very well. Even if they hurried to finish the funeral before the beginning of the Sabbath, it would have been pious and solemn, as time permits. According to the Gospels, after the funeral, the men all returned, but the women remained in front of the grave. It is a scene where the sadness of the women who wanted to keep the Lord a little longer is felt even though there is no time left until the beginning of the Sabbath. In Matthew chapter 27, verses 59 to 61 and in Luke chapter 23 verses 52 to 54.
Joseph took the body, wrapped it in a clean linen cloth, and placed it in his own new tomb that he had cut out of the rock. He rolled a big stone in front of the entrance to the tomb and went away. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were sitting there opposite the tomb. Going to Pilate, he asked for Jesus' body. Then he took it down, wrapped it in linen cloth, and placed it in a tomb cut in the rock, one in which no one had yet been laid. It was preparation day, and the Sabbath was about to begin.
The Bible says that the Sabbath was about to begin, and it means that the funeral was finished just before the Sabbath. Then, at the early dawn of the end of the Sabbath day, they visited the tomb again. Let's take a look another verse by turning to Matthew 28 verse 1.
After the Sabbath, at dawn on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to look at the tomb.
It is clear that the beginning of the day is the sunrise when you closely examine the gospel record that records Jesus' funeral process. We can also see the time system through various events recorded on the day of resurrection. In Luke chapter 24 there is a record that Jesus resurrected and appeared on that day to 2 disciples who left Jerusalem and went to Emmaus. Jesus spoke with the 2 disciples and accompanied them to Emmaus. Records indicate that when they arrived in Emmaus, it was nearly evening. The day was almost over. Let's confirm what was said by tuning to Luke chapter 24 verses 28 and 29.
As they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus acted as if he were going farther. But they urged him strongly, "Stay with us, for it is nearly evening. The day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them.
At the dinner table, the 2 disciples ate Jesus' blessed bread and finally came to recognize that he was Jesus. But he suddenly disappeared. Even though it was late that evening, the 2 disciples were surprised to have returned from Emmaus to Jerusalem just before the day was almost over. The 2 disciples gathered together with the 11 disciples. The 2 disciples informed the 11 disciples that Jesus had appeared before them, and that they had eaten bread blessed by Jesus. As they were both sharing what happened with the other disciples, Jesus himself appeared among them. Let's turn to Luke chapter 24 verses 33 through 36.
They got up and returned at once to Jerusalem. There they found the 11 and those with them, assembled together, and saying, "It is true, the Lord has risen and has appeared to Simon." Then the 2 told what had happened on the way, and how Jesus was recognized by them when he broke the bread. While they were still talking about this, Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, "Peace be with you. Look at my hands and my feet. It is I myself. Touch me and see."
The same scene is recorded in the Gospel of John. It is written that Jesus appeared to the disciples on the evening of that first day of the week. Considering the time it took for the 2 disciples to return from Emmaus to Jerusalem, it is assumed that they met the 11 disciples in Jerusalem at a very late night. However, the Gospel of John says that it happened on the first day of the week. It is the point where we know that the beginning of the day is not sunset, but sunrise. Let's turn to John chapter 20 verse 19.
On the evening of that first day of the week, when the disciples were together, with the doors locked for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you."
Now let's take a look at how the ordinance of the Day of Atonement cannot be the basis for the sunset theory. In Leviticus chapter 23 verse 32.
"It is a Sabbath of rest for you, and you must deny yourselves. From the evening of the 9th day of the month until the following evening you are to observe your Sabbath."
Based on the verse seen in Leviticus chapter 23 verse 32, some denominations claim that the beginning of a day starts at sunset. They even argue that the 7th-day Sabbath begins on Friday evening. However, the verse found in Leviticus chapter 23 verse 32 is not about the 7th-day Sabbath, it is about the ordinance of the Day of Atonement. Instead, it explained how to prepare for the Day of Atonement, regardless of the beginning of the day. Let's take a look at a few more verses by turning to Leviticus chapter 23 verses 26 to 28, and verse 32 of Leviticus chapter 23.
The Lord said to Moses, "The 10th day of this 7th month is the Day of Atonement. Hold a sacred assembly and deny yourselves, and present a food offering to the Lord. Do not do any work on that day, because it is the Day of Atonement, when atonement is made for you before the Lord your God. It is a day of Sabbath rest for you, and you must deny yourselves. From the evening of the 9th day of the month until the following evening you are to observe your Sabbath."
As mentioned in Leviticus chapter 23, there are weekly and annual appointed feasts. As you know, the 7th day of the week is the Sabbath. And it should be noted that the annual feasts are also the Sabbaths. Leviticus chapter 23 verses 26 to 28 says that the annual appointed feast, the Day of Atonement, the 10th day of the 7th month, should be kept as the Sabbath. However, it means that the Day of Atonement should be prepared with prayer for repentance to deny ourselves, especially from the evening of the previous day. To prepare for the Day of Atonement, we must rest from the evening of the 9th day of the 7th month. We can also see in the previous passage that the evening itself does not belong to the Day of Atonement. It was a special rule to rest from the previous evening for the Day of Atonement. It was not the claim of the date calculation to support the sunset theory. Now let's take a look at how Nehemiah's record cannot be the basis for the sunset theory by turning to Nehemiah chapter 13 verse 19.
When evening shadows fell on the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I ordered the doors to be shut and not opened until the Sabbath was over. I stationed some of my own men at the gates so that no load could be brought in on the Sabbath day.
Nehemiah chapter 13 verse 19 tells the circumstances of the Israelites who returned from Babylon to Jerusalem at the time of Nehemiah. Some people regard this verse as an example of the sunset theory. However, Nehemiah's command did not mean that the 7th-day Sabbath begins the previous evening. When evening shadows fell on the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, Nehemiah ordered the doors to be shut and not opened until the Sabbath was over. It was because he did not want any loads to be brought in on the Sabbath day. He tried to stop the merchants and sellers from bringing in all kinds of merchandise and selling them in Jerusalem on the Sabbath to the people of Judah. The reason for his actions was so that the Israelites would keep the Sabbath holy. In Nehemiah chapter 13 verses 15 and 16 it says that,
"In those days I saw men in Judah treading wine presses on the Sabbath and bringing in grain and loading it on donkeys, together with wine, grapes, figs, and all other kinds of loads. And they were bringing all this into Jerusalem on the Sabbath. Therefore I warned them against selling food on that day. Men from Tyre who lived in Jerusalem were bringing in fish and all kinds of merchandise and selling them in Jerusalem on the Sabbath to the people of Judah."
At that time on the Sabbath, the people near Jerusalem entered the city of Jerusalem, where the temple was located, and merchants who sold the merchandise were gathered to sell everything on the Sabbath. For instance, when it came to agricultural or marine products such as vegetables and fruits, merchants harvested them the same day and transported them to Jerusalem late at night to sell them with freshness. Governor Nehemiah wanted to keep these merchants out of the city and hoped that the temple in Jerusalem would be reverent on the Sabbath day. Therefore, he stationed some of his men at the gates from Friday evening to prohibit merchants from bringing in goods. Let's take a look at what was just said in more detail by turning to Nehemiah chapter 13 verses 20 and 21.
"Once or twice the merchants and sellers of all kinds of goods spent the night outside Jerusalem. But I warned them and said, 'Why do you spend the night by the wall? If you do this again, I will lay hands on you.' From that time on they no longer came on the Sabbath."
As the merchants were unable to enter the gates on Friday evening, they began to spend the night outside Jerusalem and attempted to bring goods into Jerusalem in the early morning. Governor Nehemiah told them that they would be arrested so that they would never be able to sell again on the Sabbath. The merchants no longer came on the Sabbath from that day on to bring in goods. Therefore, the closing of the gate on the previous evening wasn't because the Sabbath began in the evening, but it was merely a ban on the traders from bringing in goods to make the Israelites keep the Sabbath holy. That concludes this sermon. We hope you enjoyed this study. God bless you and bye for now from the Church of God Jesus Witnesses.